This webinar of the DSA Religion and Socialism Conference is hosted by the Institute for Christian Socialism, or ICS for short. I'm Josh Davis, your moderator, and I'm the Executive Director of ICS. Our topic today is Black Church Radicalism, subtitled, Where Are We Now? We'll be looking at not just the Black church tradition, which is complex and multifaceted, but at the tradition of Black church radicalism specifically, or what Gary Dorian calls Black social Christianity. And so we'll be looking at that tradition with an eye toward the role it can play, and even now is playing, in socialist organizing today. So before we start, let me take a moment to tell you a little bit about ICS, since this may be the first many of you are hearing about us. All three of our panelists today have leadership roles in ICS, and we are a nonprofit organization launched publicly in November of 2019. So we're just over a year old now, and we were founded on a commitment to organizing the Christian left and to combating the rise of the reactionary right in both politics and in theology. So we're an ecumenical organization, and we're deeply invested in fostering interreligious solidarity on the left and working for greater engagement with Christianity on the secular left. One of our organizing principles in founding ICS was our awareness that the right has, over the past 40 to 50 years, leveraged the power of the Christian churches to build a vast network of educational institutions, policy think tanks, nonprofit organizations, and political institutions that seamlessly interweave right-wing politics with Christianity in the minds of many. And not only do we think that this is a mockery of the Christian faith, but we know it is devastating to the common good and to our common humanity. So we are ecstatic to be here with you today with the DSA and to do our part in solidarity to help nurture the power of democratic socialism and explore the ways that we can contribute to that work today. And a special thanks to Maxine Phillips for the invitation to be with you and have this panel. So when it comes to the question of organizing the masses for political power, our topic today is an absolutely central one. Where are we now with regard to Black church radicalism and socialist politics? And each of our guests is well equipped to speak to this question today. So let me introduce them to you. First, the Reverend Dr. Angela Kauser is the co-chair of the board of directors of the Institute for Christian Socialism, and is Associate Dean of Black Church Studies and the Doctor of Ministry program, as well as an Associate Professor of Black Church Studies at Louisville Seminary. And she is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA. Next, Dr. Obery Hendricks is a member of the ICS Advisory Board who teaches religion and African American studies at Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary. He previously taught at Drew University and served as president of Payne Theological Seminary, which is the oldest African-American theological institution in the US. He's also the author of The Politics of Jesus, rediscovering the revolutionary nature of Jesus's teachings and how they have been corrupted. And last, but certainly not least, is the Reverend Andrew Wilkes, who is a member of the ICS Board of Directors, and he is the co-founding, co-lead pastor of the Double Love Experience Church in Brooklyn, the former executive director of the Drum Major Institute, which is a social change organization founded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and also serves on the Labor Religion Coalition of New York. Reverend Wilkes is a PhD candidate in political science at the Cooney Graduate Center and the author of Freedom Notes, Reflections on Faith, Justice, and the Possibility of Democracy. Welcome to all of you. So good to be with you.
To be with you.
To be with you as well.
Indeed, a joy.
As we begin, just a note to our audience, if you have any questions that you'd like our panelists to address, please drop them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom link there, and we'll devote the final 15 to 20 minutes of our session to answering those. Okay. Without further ado, let's get started with our questions. So where I'd like to begin is by noting the significance of the return of the Chauvin verdict this week in tandem with the recent failure of the Amazon union bid in Bessemer, Alabama. So Given the power of the police in the US, it's difficult to imagine that the Chauvin verdict would have happened apart from such successful organizing by Black Lives Matter, by churches, and by other organizations, which has been years in the making at this point. But the Amazon union bid, though, was an unfortunate loss that reflects the real weakness of organized labor now. But importantly, Black social Christianity was absolutely central to both. Jane McAlevey pointed out in The Nation just recently that faith was a key element for many of the labor leaders in Bessemer, but support from faith leaders was almost entirely absent. McAlevey took this actually to be a missed opportunity for the labor organizers, but it's just as much a failure on the part of religious leadership. So there's a very uneasy and fraught relationship between the Black church, organized labor, and socialists. And despite the long history of the Black church's struggle for emancipation, socialists have only rarely turned to the Black church tradition for insight or guidance. So with these events in mind, my first question is directed to you, Obery, first. And then I'm going to ask each of you to respond to it. But you're a biblical scholar who's written extensively on the fundamental political nature of Jesus's ministry and the Bible as a whole. Why do you think the biblical tradition and the gospel tradition specifically of Jesus are consistent with socialism and have something vital to add to the struggle today?
Thank you, Josh. And really happy to be here with my fellow freedom fighters on this panel and with the DSA audience, and very appreciative for the invitation to share here. One caveat, I'm suffering from a terrible allergy attack in New York City. And so occasionally I might do something that I might have to wipe my nose and all that. I mean, we're grown, so we'll live through it. But, when you strip away all of the ritual and the superstructures of orthodoxy and doctrine and tradition that have evolved, over the years in service to successive ruling classes, we see that there's a shared ethical focus between social democratic socialism in particular and the biblical witness. And that shared focus is egalitarian justice, focus on the common good. The most often cited ethical concept in the Bible is justice, right? And justice in the sense that everybody should be treated in equal ways. But when you couple that with the explicit pronouncement in Leviticus, which Jesus quotes, says that to love your neighbor as yourself, and he says this is equal to the greatest of all commandments, so it gives it primacy here. Love your neighbor as yourself is one of the same goods and services and wealth and authority and all legitimacy and all the kinds of good things that we all want for ourselves. What that says is, you couple them, what that says is egalitarian justice, which is fundamental to socialism. And then that's not all, though. The second most often occurring ethical term in the Bible is tzedakah, the Hebrew, usually translated as righteousness with the connotation of personal piety, but that's incorrect. It really has to do with doing right, doing justly in community, in society. You couple that tzedakah, the second most cited ethical concept, with mishpat, justice, the most cited, and together they are the most cited pairing in the Bible. What you get is social justice is the ethical foundation of the biblical witness. Now I'm talking about the biblical witness without the superstructure of all kinds of stuff that was laid upon it later. And then just another dimension to speak of the gospel, Jesus was an ethical teacher. He didn't teach, you don't see him talking about doctrines and what you should believe and all that. He talks about, really what he talks about more than anything other than God is poor folks and poverty. And in what Luke presents as his first public proclamation, Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, not so I can jump and shout and go crazy. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, so that I might bring good news to the poor. And good news to the poor is not that some folk will be made rich while it stays poor. It must be structural change, addressing the policies and structures and relationships that make people poor and keep them poor. And then finally, the only real mode of judgment that Jesus gives in the Gospels. I know we hear a lot of Christian judgment these days about you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you must be saved, and whatever that means. But what Jesus gives as the only real mode of judgment is, in summary, it's in Matthew 25, 31 through 46. I've summarized it. He is saying that if you have tried to feed the hungry and to clothe the naked, to house the homeless, to make this a better society for everyone, then you will be judged as just by God. But if you have not done these things, it says, then you are going to hell. And so, while the biblical witness, rightly understood, can add to socialism, what can add to socialism is the understanding that our struggle is not just in service to ourselves and our neighbors, but it is in some service to something higher than ourselves, to get better in tune with creation, divine, the universe, the created order, whatever you call it, whatever you choose to call it. But it gives a dimension that we're not just doing it for those we can see, but to be more deeply in tune with all of the order of creation, that we must believe was created for us to have decent lives and living in a decent world.
Thank you. I of course want to leave space, Angela and Andrew, for you to reply to each other. So by all means, just jump in if you have anything that you want to add. And otherwise, I'll just direct the same question to each of you in turn. Angela, what would you add here? Why do you think the biblical tradition, and specifically the Gospels, is consistent with socialism and has something vital to add to the struggle for it?
You're unmuted.
I would take us back to the to the book of Deuteronomy and to the witness there, out of which Jesus draws his ethical frames and precepts, and that framework has 6 pieces to it primarily. Number one, that the purpose of the commonwealth, 2 words, is so that there will be no poor among us, so that the primary rubric and metric around which we should determine whether capitalism, socialism, whatever it is effective, is that there are no poor among us. The way that we get there is through a religion of relationships. What we have now is largely a religion of transaction. Number 2, a politics of justice, as Dr. Hendricks just said, a mishpat, which is the ethical foundation. But that the politics that we do, the relational work that we do, should be rooted in justice. Number 3, an economics of equality, of equity, that the way that we organize our resources and that we collect and distribute our resources out should be framed around equity. Number 4, that the profits should lead society. And so religion should be led by profits. What we have now is religion that's led by administrators, and basically it's a structure that's designed to perpetuate itself. But the biblical witness and the design by God was that religion would be led by prophets, and those prophets in turn would lead society as Jesus did in his witness, as Isaiah and the major minor prophets did. And
Explain prophets.
Excuse me?
Explain prophets, please.
Prophets, as I understand it, for me, are people who are following this, who are trying to lead society through their word, through their witness, through their deeds, to create religion based on relationships. 2, that there would be no poor among us, and there is no exception to that rule. There are no equivocations to that. Number 2, and there's no justification to accept it, none. Number 3, that they preach a politics of equality and equity. That's ethics. And that's what I need to be preaching about. That is a prophetic witness. Number 4, that prophets lead society. What that means is that these are people who are rooted in courage, relationship, vision, and are unequivocal in preaching that, or take no equivocation around that. And that finally, that they teach their people in word and deed to share their wealth, and they teach their people to teach their children how to do justice, so that when they go to sleep at night and when they wake up in the morning, that's what they hear their parents talking to them about. So does that help, Obery, to define what I think the biblical witness means by prophecy? It's not about foretelling or talking about what's going to be happening in the future or divining. It's really about the ethical mandate that you talked about Jesus lived out, that is rooted in the Deuteronomistic witness and precept as God has designed it for the way a society should be. I'll stop right there.
It's forthtelling, right? Not just foretelling.
For it's forthtelling. And so that religion and the prophets should lead in economics, should lead in politics, and they should be following us. And that we have enough power, we don't now, but we have enough power to be able to say that we want to reorganize society around a framework of equity, a framework of justice. How that gets worked out is a whole nother matter, but that's what it's supposed to be.
And these are not just, I mean, from the point I take you to be making, is that these are not just moral ideals that prophets are holding out for people to live up to or to try to live up to, but it's actually an articulation of a social life.
It is a complete articulation of a way a social life should be organized. And then there's the Jubilee that's incorporated in there, where every 7 years you're forgiving debt so that you have no poor among you.
Yep. And no past.
There's a great book by just to hop in on this question as well. I didn't cut you off, did I, Dr. Kauser? Okay. There's a great book by Dr. Liz Theo Harris that deals with the kind of the poor you will always have among you, because that's often one of the most, when people are citing chapter and verse against socialism, they'll say, but didn't Jesus say? And there's a great misinterpretation of Jesus there. So if you're looking for a text, what did Jesus really mean when you talk about the poor you always have among you? That's one among others that you can go to. On this question of the gospel and its consistency with socialism, I've often kind of taught and preached about the church as a kind of anti-capitalist mutual aid society. And I think you see that powerfully in the book of the collection of Luke Acts. So if you look at Acts 2 and Acts 4, there's this tradition that cuts against private property and acquisition, where possessions are stewarded in common. And we could even say a rough paraphrase of it is from each as you have ability and possessions, and to each as you have need. So there's a kind of antecedent Marxist sort of dimension there from a consumption and circulation of goods standpoint. And that's not lost on socialists. Rosa Luxemburg has a pamphlet on socialism in the churches, where she makes the case that you see a kind of communism, not as to production, but as to consumption. So that's right there in the text, even though we gloss over it. You can also look to Psalms in the 24th to 27th division, where it talks about the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If that's true, that we could kind of make an argument that God's kind of stewardship of the earth precedes any sorts of enclosure of the commons, right? Then that gives us some of the content we need for the to steward the land, not as the deed or property of real estate or some chamber of commerce, but as belonging collectively to us. I think the other tradition that's worth lifting up that name here is Mary. You know, so often we jump to Jesus and we skip over Mary's Magnificat. But when she tells us that the hungry are being filled with good things and the rich are being sent away empty. That sounds like the kind of prototype for a sort of Black church radicalism. But the problem is we so often invert the Magnificat, right? Where we want the rich to go away with good things and the hungry to be sent away empty. So listening to Mary, and not just Mary's baby, can help us get to a Black radical church.
She said her baby was the herald of that new order.
That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, thank you. This was great, and I mean, you all talked for 20 minutes about that. I mean, that's wonderful, and I hope we can carry these things forward as we continue to think through the way in which Black church radicalism really is like plugged into that, all of these dimensions of Scripture and to the teachings of Jesus and Jesus's own life, and animating them and bringing them to life particularly in the United States of America. It's a Black social gospel tradition that's rooted in emancipation and abolition and all of these. And, you know, I mentioned Gary Dorian earlier, but in his book, The New Abolition, he says, like, this tradition of Black social Christianity is strangely overlooked in the history of Black radicalism. And I think it's particularly important. Just this morning, I saw on social media a video of Anthony Penn complaining to James Cone that the Black church gets too much credit for the civil rights movement. And I just thought, well, whoa, what's going to come later on today? And I couldn't help but think, I mean, what emerged in 1955 was the result of at least 80 years worth of prior abolitionist work that was forged by Black social Christianity. And so anyway, Andrew, could you give the audience a bit of an overview of what we mean by Black church radicalism as an emancipatory force in U.S. Christianity and politics?
Yeah, happy to speak to that. I think it's really important to ground varieties of Black church radicalism in the collective, as opposed to a kind of individual Hall of Fame, where you may have MLK here, you may have Ida B. Wells there, or so on and so forth. And so when you think about the denominational histories of say the AME Church, and you think of Free African Society in Philadelphia, which is organized as a kind of mutual aid movement, pushing back also against abolitionism to some degree. From that rich soil, the AME Church is born. When you think about Reverend D. Ransom as a part of that church tradition, and I know I'm speaking with the president of an AME, former president of AME denominations seminary here. You think about Ransom becoming a Black social gospeler, but also a Black socialist in Chicago in response to industrial capitalism. So there's a history and a telling of the AME Church that has a strain of socialism that's indigenous to the church. But also think of a couple in Boston who in the 50s are talking about Edward Bellamy's novel, Looking Backward, which is a socialist novel, which was given from Coretta to a young brother named Martin, right? And so in the 50s, we often talk about King getting radical in the 60s, but in the 50s, they're having this conversation about monopoly capitalism being more socialistic than capitalistic, about nationalizing industry, property, and so forth. So I think it's important to kind of see that not only as lifting up Martin and Coretta, but to see them as a kind of synecdoche of a wider confrontational kind of Baptist tradition that Jim Washington, among others, talks about in Frustrated Fellowship. And so I just picked those two denominations as one among others that speak to the radical potential of the Black church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. It's hugely helpful. And so many of these figures are just not as widely known as they should be. Angela, who are your heroes and inspirations for the work of organizing and teaching that you do in this history? You're muted still.
Two women in particular come to mind, and they would not be considered sort of socialist in avowedly socialists, but I think what they did in practice was socialism. The first is Ida Robinson, I think is her name. She was the first bishop of the Mount Sinai Holiness Church, created a structure and a denomination that was nationwide, that was led by women, Black women particularly, starting in the 1920s, that had a radical sort of egalitarian frame to it. The second person that I find completely compelling in this area, that again does not carry a socialist label, is Harriet Tubman, and in the way in which she and others, many others, the unnamed faithful, created essentially a freedom train out of terrorism into freedom. The third person I want to talk about, who's also may not make sense, is John Brown, who phenotypically was white, but I think in practice and in commitments was completely committed to Black liberation and Black freedom, and his outline for a new society had many socialist elements to it, as he put it together in his Declaration of Independence. And then the fourth movement is the Foreman Black Manifesto movement, 1967, 1968. I think James Cone would have argued, and rightly so, that this was at least at the end of the civil rights movement, the sort of culminating document around reparations. And then the fifth, which very few people know about, is something that I'm working with a group of pastors and organizers, and we're calling it a Jubilee campaign that helps to free Black people and people in this country from debt peonage, that deconstructs consumer credit card debt, student loan debt, family farm and small business debt, medical debt, the creation of a 21st century Homestead Act, the ending of usurious interest rates, and the reform of the credit scoring and rating oligopoly, and the adoption of a baby bonds program for the next generation of children. So there's a group of people that I'm working with around. I didn't come up with that. I'm just working with a group of organizers around this and trying to get to the Biden administration to put this on the table as an actual new 21st century move towards reparations for Black people in this nation that feeds off of 1968 and Foreman.
Thank you, Angela. Obery, what would you add?
Well, I'd add, Angela, just at the things Angela mentioned in this document that she implied but didn't come around and say, is that these are all biblical ideas, biblically based ideas about debt, about the kind of measures that keep a permanent wealthy class, right, from developing. And so, you know, these ideas, every one of them she mentioned, can be traced really back as far as Deuteronomy, right? Just a couple things to mention. Yeah, I push back against the Black church. Has always been on, I hear all the time, the forefront of this freedom movement. Some Black churches have been. Many Black churches, if not most, have been enthralled to ruling class religious hegemony, right? And just like, you know, most white churches, and they can't be faulted for that, but they, as a result, they were not really involved in any radical movement. When Martin Luther King was trying to call together ministers to support his Poor People's Campaign, one meeting he invited, I believe, 103 ministers in Virginia to the meeting. And time for the meeting came. I'm not going to ask anyone to guess how many came. Nobody came, zero. That gives some kind of sense what we're talking about. But also in the Black church tradition, both Andrew and Angela talked about it. There is this genealogy of Black Christian socialism, right? Going back to George Washington Woodbey, who took many behind whippings on the street preaching socialism out in San Diego, California. Huh? You said many? Oh yeah.
I would just
he was a hard head. Yeah, he was a hard head. Like the brother in Birmingham, Reverend begins with F. Shuttlesworth said God knew he would need a hard head because he'd get a lot of beatings, so God gave him a hard head. But then we come up through like Mordecai Johnson, right? Who ended up being the president of Howard University. He was a democratic socialist, like Christian socialist. Benjamin Mays was a professed democratic socialist. That comes up to Martin Luther King, who toward the end finally started admitting that he was a democratic socialist. And you see it coming up, it's culminating with us today. So, there's always been that strain, meaning that there's always been that correct understanding of the biblical witness in the church. But it's just not widespread. It's not widespread anywhere in America. But it's not widespread in the Black church either, despite the position that we are in, socially, economically, politically.
Angela, you mentioned a few women in your answer, and I thought it would be also important to underscore the critique made by womanists to the patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia of both the Black church and Black radicalism too. How should we think about womanism as an integral part of the Black church radicalism itself? Is that fair characterization?
Yeah, so womanism was a reaction to the hegemonic patriarchy coming out of essentially Black liberation theology and theologies. And because women and any analysis of gender discrimination was markedly absent from those analyses, and they were right, and they are still right today. So I think womanism, mujerista, queer, come off of the sort of the trunk of the tree are these broad liberation theology themes, and there are these branches that come off of that tree, of which womanism is one. And quite frankly, I still think in Black church, largely in much of Black church life still today, we are enthralled to the charismatic male leader and the charismatic male voice, and spend a significant amount of time on the oppression of female leadership and female voices and female vision. And that is, in my political analysis, part of the reason as to why we still have not the power that we need to have, that God has given us, because we cannot, it's inconsistent to call for racial justice in this nation while we have our boots on the necks of women.
Yeah. But let me add on.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Obery.
Yeah, womanism, and also, implicit in what you're saying is womanism is also a reaction to the white-dominated feminism.
Yes.
White feminists, right? Who showed no sense, show no sensitivity, no awareness, and no focus on the peculiar struggles that Black women have to.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's
and we see that today, even with the struggles with the National Organization for Women, and all the storm and drag that's happening there internally around an organization that should be right now at its nadir of power, and is not, because it still cannot contend with or deal frontally with racism in its own ranks.
I think
so. I mean, if we're going to be for equality and equity, we need to be for equality and equity, period. And it hobbles us to be inconsistent in this struggle.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. I'm sorry, Andrew.
No apologies at all. We're sharing deliberative space together. I think one of the unfortunate tendencies that tends to perpetuate and further some of the oppression along the lines of gender identity and gender that Dr. Cowles is mentioning is the way we tell the history of Black church radicalism and don't lift up always the critical intellectual contributions that womanists and Black feminists make to that tradition. So I'm thinking of Alice Walker, whose poem on democratic socialist womanism not only brings those together, but the poem itself calls for a distinct kind of ecological vision and how we relate ourselves to the earth and to nature in ways that are powerful and consistent with womanist insistence for pushing for kind of public health and the healing of entire populations. I think of Dr. Day's work, which is one of the most seminal contributions, Reverend Dr. Carrie Day's Religious Resistance to Neoliberalism, Womanist and Black Feminist Perspectives, and talking about what does it mean to have love and a sense of desire and eros and care being an organizing principle as we talk about justice. And that kind of linking of eros and agape as we push for justice and a new political economy, I think is a much different way of talking about justice than when we only talk about, there's a pharaoh everywhere on Wall Street and on your street, or, we got to confront the powers and the principalities. Yes, amen, that's true. And also, we have multiple wells we should be drawing from so that everyone who's a part of Black churches or adjacent to them can see this work we're doing as our common purchase.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And pivoting off the question of power, which well, it's really at the center of everything that we're doing here. But as we turn toward this question of like what it means to empower the disempowered and etc.
So I don't do empowerment, so I'm not going to talk about empowerment, and I'm not going to talk about disempowerment. I want to talk about power, because empowerment is a corruption of the word power, and it's a tool in my mind of capitalism and of refusing to contend with power by using the word empowerment. So just a caveat there.
I receive the correction.
Thank you.
So turning to this most pressing issue of power and social power and organizing social power, is that good?
Yes.
When we talk about Black church radicalism, it's often missed, right? That this is not moralism. It's not condemning things like excessive wealth or counseling love as the basis for political struggle or political decisions. Black church radicals and this tradition that we're talking about, the biblical tradition, the theological tradition, the church tradition, are talking about a political project of emancipation and that was formed on the basis of the press toward emancipation and abolition and has continued in these economic areas like you're talking about. So Angela, from your experience in organizing, what do you want Christian faith leaders to know about organizing for power? And what do you want those involved in the socialist struggle to know about the role of churches in organizing for power?
So I think it's either in 1st or 2nd Timothy, the writer there says in the 1st chapter that he's writing to Christian communities, and he says, God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power and love and self-control. 1. Number 2, in order to rebuild Jerusalem, in the first 8 or 9 chapters of the book of Nehemiah, we have an extensive treatise of this narrative from Nehemiah's perspective of the way to organize, to rebuild, to literally rebuild a city and to help rebuild a people. Ezra gives us that with the ethical and the religious precepts. Nehemiah gives us the organizing precepts to do that. Power is the ability to act. Powerlessness is the inability to act. All of us have power. It is a gift and an endowment from God. The only question is, do we use it? And if so, do we use it in ways that increase creativity and love and equity? Or do we use it in ways to decrease equity and love and increase evil and injustice and oppression? I argue that the creative use of the organizing of power, which is organized people and organized money, can and has been demonstrated over the past 50 years to be used to help school children get an equitable education and go on and live productive lives. Number two, to build housing for poor and working class people, low wealth people, so that they can have equity and pass that on generationally to their progeny and change their family tree. Three, to build public transportation systems that work for people and that don't increase suffering and pain for them, and that are safe for people to use. So when I talk about organizing, I'm talking about organizing people, money, and institutions and social capital to confront corrupt power in politics, that is in government and in business, to be more equitable. It is the call back to rethink how to use the commonwealth so that there are no poor among us. So I'm saying in order to get no poor among us, you got to organize.
What's the difference between?
It cannot just be a rhetorical call. You have to have a set of tools, a set of practices that have been tested, retested, refined, reformed over generations, so that in order to make these changes, and they have to be done, I think, institutionally. That's the way I know how to do it, is to organize institutions.
I know you make a distinction between organizing and mobilizing. Can you unpack that a little bit for us, and why you prefer to talk about organizing?
So organizing, the best organizing is about finding and developing leaders and building power for generations. The best organizing is proactive. It is not reactive to much of anything. The best organizing is proactive around an agenda that is built from the bottom up. It is built from a series of relational meetings and house meetings that's built over time, so that we come up with an agenda and a platform that is deeply rooted in people in these institutions, out of which they will act, because it speaks to their interests, their concerns, their pain. That is a process that is a politics of equity. That is a religion of relationships. A religion of relationships and a politics of equity will yield relational meetings, will yield house meetings, will yield a platform around all of these issues that are very, very concrete, that concern how we live together. And then we organize those institutions, their money and their people and their social capital, to negotiate with governors, mayors, business leaders, to actually make concrete changes. That's what organizing is. That's the best of the tradition.
Yeah.
Can I hop in on this point? I appreciate Dr. Kaiser's point here, because I want to try to state the point generously. There is widespread association of Black churches turning out voters as itself inherently organizing and tilting towards justice. And while that tradition is important to applaud, affirm, securing the right to vote was drenched in blood and a great many other things for Black folks and for other populations. Not only electoral mobilizing, but also issue-based mobilizing, even if it's for important things like Medicare for all. If we have a mobilizing around issues that is lobbying for legislative passage, that's getting people to back a particular candidate, that doesn't move to rearrange how we think about factors of production, right? How we use our land, how we use our labor, how we use fiscal resources to get more towards a beloved community where we are not dominated by the decisions of investors and capitalists, what you might call it in New Testament language, powers and principalities, the circuits of capital and Marx's language. I think it's important to lift up that kind of organizing work and to ground it. I want to appeal to Howard Thurman here. He talks about Jesus as a kind of labor union leader in some ways. And so if we think about an unhoused, some argue perhaps illiterate Jesus, who's bringing people together and has a common purse and bequeaths a kind of movement to us, I think that points to organizing to shift how we coordinate the production, the distribution, and the meeting of our material needs in the world. I think that's an important turn to distinguish from the kind of hagiography and celebration of the Black church, which may be commendable, but not necessarily radical.
Yeah, and not necessarily always correct. I'd like to just add something to Dr. Kauser's her exposition and enumeration and articulation of the various ways that we need to organize. And I think that part of that should also be that we must articulate our ethical foundation, you know, the foundation we're moving from. That's why Martin Luther King talked about a revolution of values, right? Be clear. And churches have not really done that. I mean, they'll talk about the kingdom of God or being saved and all that, but they're, you know, that's not really, generally, that's just not the case. But also in terms of that, you know, it's important. Archaeologists have found first century Israel, you know, skeletal remains of workers that showed that their actual skeletons were deformed from the extent of their labor, and remains were found. A great many of them were suffering from malnutrition. And so, you know, Jesus says things like, come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. In other words, you know, his vision is of the kind of society, the kind of political economy in which workers are not exploited and worked to death and beaten down. And in the parable of the workers in the vineyard in Matthew 20, he explicitly engages in what I think Paulo Freire calls conscientization, you know, to raise the consciousness of the workers, to counter the hegemony of the owner class, to expose to the workers the full contours of the exploitation that they're expanding. But not only that, he also demonstrates the need for workers' solidarity, because part of what he narrates is how one worker is identified and called out in order to break the unity of the workers. And so I just really want to, you know, to emphasize that also part of the gospel message is that workers, that it recognizes the struggles of workers and the need for workers to be, to come together, to coalesce in solidarity. And that's so very, very important. That's missed often.
Mm-hmm.
I want to piggyback on that and say that I'm not altogether clear, given the historical record, the empirical record, that relationships between organized labor and churches are going to change in any significant way. Mm. Where I think there is some play is with organizations in communities that do community organizing. That's where I think there can be some synergy, some linkages, and some power built between unions and community organizing groups, because they largely have similar goals and aims.
That's true.
And this is where this alienation, this misunderstanding between organized labor and organized religion, which is what broad-based organizing is so damaging. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's where I'm not sure that looking to individual churches and pastors for support is a long-term strategy. It may be a short-term strategy for some kind of a campaign, but we saw in Bessemer that did not yield.
Right.
What is I think more fruitful, and where there really needs to be a hard look, is with community organizing groups, IAF, Gamaliel, that are all over this nation, between those groups and organized labor. And that's where the conversations, if they are not happening, need to happen.
But and you're absolutely right. And I think that when I talk about a revolution of values, you know, we have to proclaim what the gospel says. Anyway, you know, it's about raising consciousness, and I think you're absolutely right. It's going to, for a number of reasons. I know it's a long-term practice. One reason people are so suspicious of unions because they've been so racist for so long. I heard the stories my father told, what he went through joining the bricklayers union. But you know, it has to be proclaimed. We have to reorient these folk. Many of them are not coming along, but we have to proclaim it anyway. And we also, it's also important, I think, for non-religious socialists to realize that we're not at odds at all with that. This part of our basic, the witness of our faith, that workers should be in solidarity, because often, you know, we don't want to be lumped in with the more backward elements of the Black church community, right? And or judged by that, because you know they're speaking out of a real successful hegemonic thrust against Black community and Black churches.
Yeah, and I reread before this webinar Cohn's booklet, what the Marxism has to say and the Black church have to say to each other, and his essential argument is that unless and until white socialists deal with their own racism, you're not going to get a hearing in Black churches. It's not going to happen.
It's true.
It's not going to happen. And again, and that's because of the inconsistency.
Mm-hmm.
We can't call for reform of society unless and until we reform our own house.
Yeah.
That's
We can't. It's inconsistent. The stool is wobbly. It's not stable.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is, on the other side of this, Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Wilkes, on the other side of this, there's justifiable suspicion.
Yeah.
Because of the persistence of white racism and white supremacy.
Absolutely.
So I'm just saying, this is just Angela talking. I'm just saying, among the DSA and other socialist groups, if that kind of cleansing work is not being done, then you're wasting your time going to Black churches. You're wasting your time. Do the repentance work first in your own house. Demonstrate that concretely, and then let's talk.
Yeah. And it's not just about it's a squandering of an important constituency and source of resources for the struggle.
Absolutely.
That, you know, and then, I mean, I'm speaking to us here and others. You know, we don't go in condescending, speak to them like they're backward. These are the people. If we're out to convert the masses to our cause, you know, that's where the masses are. No matter how you might, you know, look at them, that's where the masses of the people are, and we must speak to them in their frame and convince them of the rightness and righteousness of our cause, so they can come along with us.
Absolutely. Want to say yay and amen to the need to do that kind of internal work of accountability.
Yeah.
I think that's true, has been true historically, right? When we look at folks like Eugene Debs, not necessarily having a deep racial analysis, when we look historically in American politics at what was once called the Negro question being seen as effectively a distraction from class politics. You know, we could go on and on and on. The fracturing between the Black Panthers, Students for a Democratic Society, and some of those generational battles which we're still wrestling with now. The one thing that I'd say that I think is imperative to make sure we have a diffuse power equation, because I think Dr. DeKalzer took us down this path in a helpful way. I'd say alongside your IAFs, Gamaliels, your faith and actions, we need to recognize that to get to the public interest, labor unions have to be at the table. And I think there's some evidence that in the same way that all Black churches aren't radical, some are, there are some labor unions that I think are trying to do important kinds of work. Labor unions have been supportive of the Poor People's Campaign. I think of labor unions in New York that Labor Religion Coalition works with. And I mention that because if we don't tap into the base of power that specifically teachers unions have, that care-oriented unions have, Josh, I know this is the point that you have raised before, it makes it tough for us to have the constituency in elections and to win the specific kinds of policy that we might want, right? A community land trust, a sovereign wealth fund, that you see to some degree. I'm going to try to come back to the Black church piece. Black churches that have credit unions, Black churches that know what it is to face racism when you have the same profile, but you can't get a loan, you can't get resources to finance expansion of your operations. And so if we take that merited fiscal skepticism that Black churches know all too much about, we can move from there to public banking. We can move from there, as someone like a DMin Coates is doing, to modern monetary theory, and recognizing that the deficit mongering that sometimes even liberal folk engage in doesn't have to be part and parcel of what we're doing as Black churches, trying to resource a theology of abundance when we talk about meeting the needs of our people.
Thank you both, for all three of you for that. That's wonderful analysis. And it butts right up against a question that I wanted to follow up with this with, which is the specific aspect of organizing Christian socialist spaces, right? Like what does organizing congregations look like in a Christian socialist space? Because there's the aspect of wider socialist organizing, moving to churches to mobilize them for their cause, but there's also what it looks like to begin to organize churches, to think about them in the way that Thurman talked about them as, Jesus starting a labor union, essentially. Being a disciple of Jesus is like being a part of a union. Angela, what would you have to say about that?
The elimination of capitalism in Cuba has not eliminated racism in Cuba.
Right.
We have to be honest and say in our own house, where has the elimination of capitalism lifted racism? Where has the elimination of capitalism eliminated poverty?
Right.
And be able to demonstrate in practical terms why a socialist order, socio-political, economic order is better than capitalism. We have to be able to demonstrate that concretely. That's a quote tool that when I sit down with a pastor, a rabbi, I need to have. And right now, I'm just thinking in my own, in the United States, and I am as ignorant. So if I sound ignorant, it's because I am. When I think about models of socialist economic order, I think about farmers in Wisconsin. I think about dairy farmers in Vermont who who have created a creamery operation that's a sort of a co-op model. I think about the organization in Spain. I forget the name of it. That is yes. and then in the developing world, the shack dwellers they wouldn't call it socialism, but I absolutely call what they do socialism. They have gotten very, 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 very low wealth women out of poverty, period. And they've done it through a socialist model. So we have to have, I would love to sit down with a pastor relationally and say that ICS and DSA and Wendland Cook and other organizations have done the internal work on themselves to cleanse themselves, to repent of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, that they have done that work, and they are doing that work. They are in the process of becoming, so that we can demonstrate a witness that is different than what we've got right now, which is the same old stale racism. I don't know if I'm making sense, I'm sounding wild-eyed, but when I go and sit with pastors to work with them, to organize them into a community organizing group, I've got to have something in there that speaks to their self-interest.
Absolutely. I think that's an important, powerful point. There's a thread that's emerging in the comments about, what does it look like to grapple with this racism that you see? And I would maybe even push the point, white supremacy is something that not only is in predominantly white organizations, you see that in organizations that Black folks lead as well. So it's a challenge in many ways. There's also a question, I think, was on the table about what kind of Black churches are kind of moving in this sort of direction. And hopefully I think this is a charitable way to put it and an accurate way to put it. I think when we think of folks like the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, when you think of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Network, when you think of, I think I've seen Reverend Heber Brown here, the Black Church Food Security Network, the practices of organizing people, the practices of thinking about what justice looks like in terms of political economy, specifically around healthcare, education, housing, and guaranteeing employment. That work, I think, has a latent anti-capitalism that is deeply embedded in Black churches. And the problem is, how do we kind of lift up stories of the best of multiracial traditions of socialism that make the kind of connection that King would make of that triad of love, justice, and power? Because at the end of the day, we need power in sufficient density to win, consolidate, and build the kind of world that we're looking for. And so
must have it.
Must have it. It's not going to come from silver-tongued policy reports from well-articulated press releases.
No.
So I think of the work, particularly of Community Land Trust, which emerges down in Albany, Georgia. And I'll just go ahead and drop a book, a sister by the name of Jessica Gordon-Nimhard, Collective Courage, that names the history of African-American cooperative traditions in the country. And I mention that because, to Dr. Hendricks' points, when you're organizing among any people, including Black diasporic people, we need genealogies that acknowledge the labor, the sacrifice, the intellectual contributions, and the institutional innovations of our people. Because otherwise, it sounds like we're trying to import and impose something without acknowledging the generational struggle, advance that has happened over the years.
As a biblical scholar, I mean, the reason I became a biblical scholar is because so much in Christendom, I mean, you can talk a lot of theology, but ultimately people want to see something about chapter and verse. And they want to know, they have to be disabused of their misunderstandings of the God, of the biblical witness. And so the part of it, when we talk about revolutionary values, is also teaching or redefining, reclaiming the rudiments of the faith tradition that they claim to be their own, to lift up, these foundational principles for them that support the kinds of things we're talking about, so that it's not just a choice of whether we want to get involved in community action or not. It is that it is a demand of your faith, pastor. And this is something that you need to pay, and you must read the newspaper and start paying more close attention to what's going on in the society, and then impart it to your people, congregation.
That would be a good point for us to turn to questions from the audience, specifically on that front, because we have one from the Reverend Heber Brown that's asked to speak directly to this question of racism and socialist organizations. They write, I'd be curious to hear the panelists speak to what compelled them to join DSA, if they are members, or whatever other socialist configurations that they're aligned with, despite the stated concerns around race. Dr. Hendricks, would you like to take response to that?
I'm the newest member here of the organization, I believe. I'm not a member of DSA, I'm a member of ICS, Institute for Christian Socialism, because like Martin Luther King, I see interfaces between democratic socialism and the gospel witness. And they're not, they're interfaces. It's not perfect, but it's much more, has much more to do with socialism than with capitalism. And I joined because I was looking for an organization of like minds who are concerned about transforming the political economy to one of equitable justice, egalitarian justice. That's why I joined it. And the group is well balanced in many ways. This not, but well, I mean, we all are aligned against white supremacy. We see it as an ideological deformation of the human spirit, and that works for me. I think that's what had to be the case for me to join an organization. And also, it's important to join progressive organization when you are, as a Christian activist. So that's why I am here. And I must say I'm very happy about it. I'm thrilled actually to be with people of like mind.
Dr. Kauser?
I'm not a member of DSA. I'm a member of ICS, the Institute for Christian Socialism, and very glad to be so, because it has, even as a child, listening to the gospel being read in church, I wondered whether it was possible to do what Jesus outlined with the current structure. And I grew up with the assassination of Dr. King 2 miles from my church. With the sanitation workers, and understanding, even as a child, some sense of the struggle that they were dealing with, because I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. Where I'm going with that is that it came to a head when I was in seminary, and really realizing I don't know that it's possible to create the kind of society that Jesus has outlined, and that the Hebrew prophets have outlined under a capitalist framework. And so when Tim Eberhard came and said, we're founding ICS, it made sense to me to be a part of that. It also only makes sense to me to be a part of an organization where people are working on repentance, metanoia.
Reverend Wilkes?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Angela.
And that ICS represents that for me. Thank you.
I'm a proud member of both ICS and DSA. I'll start with ICS and then go to DSA. I think in this particular historical moment that we live in, as with previous historical moments, our politics are always approximations of our theological values. They're never complete equations to it. But that said, my theological conviction has been for some time now that to get to something resembling beloved community requires something that looks like or similar to democratic socialism. Some call it economic democracy, cooperative commonwealth. You can kind of pick your term, but as Amilcar Cabral put it, it's the interests and the meeting of our needs and creating the possibilities for creativity and flourishing that I think is something of an article of faith. And I think the best construals of the biblical witness point in that direction. As it relates to DSA, I think Fred Hampton's the best of his legacy, right? Because no one's perfect, but the insight of the Rainbow Coalition, where you bring together the Black Panthers, you bring together what ultimately becomes the Young Lords, you bring together Native American folks who are organizing, you bring together young, I think it may have been Young Patriots in Chicago at the time, is the idea that you have to build a polycentric basis of power in order to get what it is that we deserve. White folks can't do that alone. Black folks can't do that alone. And I'm not calling for a bland multiculturalism. I'm calling for a historically conscious conflict leaning into attempt to build the world that at that brief interlude where you could look to a SNCC, and I may be engaging in some historical romanticizing, but y'all indulge me briefly. I'll try to make the point succinctly. When you look at SNCC, you look at SCLC, you look at SDS, you look at your entity and their Port Huron statement, for instance, you look at your Black Panthers, your Deacons for Defense. When you have that kind of ethically oriented and religiously conscious, organized across lines of faith and in defiance of our histories of white supremacy, those to me seem to be the political and ethical terms for which all of our projects get off the ground, and without which we get people selling to us minority and women-owned business enterprises as liberation. You get Richard Nixon in 1968 saying Black capitalism is, you know, basically getting your piece of the pie in the action, and take that as the fulfillment of what our ancestors died for. So it has to be deeply rooted in Blackness, but affirming a kind of multiracial push for liberation, I think.
Mm-hmm. So well said. So well said.
I want to get this last question in, and Reverend Wilkes, I'm going to address it to you first. So just keep rolling. It's from Alan Perez, and I think it's an important question because I have been in conversations with each of you in which this has come up, and it may be particularly relevant given Martin Luther King's legacy and his own decisions. And also what moment we are in with regard to Black church radicalism and socialism. But Alan Perez writes, I believe that in general, the ethical principles of religion are reflected in socialist principles. However, the word socialism means many things, sometimes opposite. Do we have to use that word? And if the answer is yes, how do we explain our socialism?
Mm-hmm. 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 Good question.
It's a fantastic question. I would approach the question this way. Do we have to appreciate the legacy of, or what happens when we, I put it that way, builds consciously on the legacy of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and Claudia Vera Jones, who's talking about tridimensional theories of oppression along the lines of gender, race, and class in the 40s, and is deported from the country, and is literally, there's a great book on her legacy called Left of Marx that talks about some of the great work that she's done. If we talk about what it means to build on the legacies of these people, we could call it any number of things, and have called it any number of things, but it is that type of approach to creating policy, to empowering worker centers, unions, and having our churches, our mosques, our synagogues, our ethical culture societies, which we have in New York, come one and come all, right? To build a world where macroeconomic planning is explicitly trying to do what Ajamu Baraka calls people-centered human rights. That's the North Star. And there's reasons of faith to want to push in that direction. So I would be more doctrinaire on the outcomes, the vision, and the democratic process than I would be on the label necessarily.
That was you ended right on the mark. Thank you. In terms of the time that we have, Dr. Kauser, Dr. Hendricks, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
He did a very good job. I think I would only add that as I presented at times, I just present. I think it's important just to focus on the ethics. That's what when you talk about Christianity, that's what Jesus did. He talked in ethical terms, so we can agree on our ethical foundations, ethical frameworks, without naming it, and without talking about religion. And you have to subscribe to what we have to. And as in the Christian religion, as far as I'm concerned, well, let me leave it at that. We focus on the ethics, okay? And so we don't have to name socialism or anything else. We agree with the ethics and the outcomes, as Andrew so eloquently put it. Mm-hmm.
Dr.
The only thing I would add is that we need to redefine socialism because it's a pejorative and it's in the larger political vocabulary, and we redefine it by the kind of people that we are, the kind of work that we do, and the kind of repentance, the kind of ethics that we actually live. Then we can call it whatever the hell we want to call it. But it's because of the kind of lives that we lead, the kinds of politics that we do in practice that will compel and make what we do fragrant and cause us to be evangelists for the gospel of Jesus Christ, Buddha, whatever it is. But it's because of the fragrance that we leave.
Come on, fragrance.
All right?
Leave the fragrance, right, fragrance.
The lives that we live is the repentance that we do that compels, that gives me social capital to sit with a pastor and say, come join us.
Yeah, absolutely. May I just say this, in the politics of Jesus, I put it this way, that the call is to treat the people's needs as holy.
Right.
That's what we're talking about. We're talking about economic. We're talking about, we don't have to mention socialism necessarily, because I agree with Angela. A lot of they hear that, they think of Stalin, but that phrase, treat the people's needs as holy, I think that can be heard.
Thank you all. That concludes our webinar for today, and thank you, Reverend Dr. Angela Kauser, Dr. Obery Hendricks, and the Reverend Andrew Wilkes, and thank you to everyone that joined us via Zoom. This session is brought to you by the Institute for Christian Socialism, and we are a nonprofit organization committed to building a movement of the ecumenical Christian left. All of our panelists are involved in the leadership of ICS, and if you're intrigued by our work, if you want to get involved, if you want to offer support, or if you just want to know more, please go to www.christiansocialism.com. You can follow us on Twitter under the handle @SmashMammon. And since our work is at present entirely donor supported, if you'd like to support us financially, please go to www.christiansocialism.com/support. I'm Josh Davis, your moderator and the executive director of ICS. Please now go in peace to love one another and smash Mammon. Goodbye.